March 7, 1892, Montreal Herald, Montreal, Canada. Real Ghost Stories. A Spectral Funeral with Blue Light Accompaniments. A Gaunt Spectre, Foster's grim adventure on an unusually dark night. Saved by a dream, a relative of Sir Walter Scott anticipates a murderer. An instance in which a dream was useful in preventing an impending catastrophe is recorded of a daughter of Mrs. Rutherford at Etterton, the granddaughter of Sir Walter Scott. This lady dreamed more than once that her mother had been murdered by a servant. She was so much upset by this that she returned home and, to her great astonishment and not a little to her dismay, she met, on entering the house, the very servant she had met in her dream. He had been engaged in her absence. She prevailed upon a gentleman to watch in an adjoining room during the following night. About 3 o'clock in the morning, the gentleman heard footsteps on the stairs, came out and met the servant carrying a quantity of coals. Being questioned as to where he was going, he answered confusedly that he was going to mend the mistress's fire, which at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of summer, was evidently impossible. On further investigation, a strong knife was found hidden in the coals. The lady escaped, but the man was subsequently hanged for murder, and before his execution, he confessed that he intended to have assassinated Mrs. Rutherford. A Gaunt Spectre. The scene of the following ghastly adventure is a solitary country road at night. We skip the writer's previous dream and come at once to the creeps. Nothing remarkable occurred for the first half hour. The moon was shining brightly. By and by, the route went straight through a cutting where the hedges were a little higher than ordinary. Cantering along, they had not proceeded far before the animal dropped into a walk. Encouragement and caresses were vain. Walk he would. Suddenly, the horse came to a dead halt in the middle of the road. The suddenness of stopping nearly unseated the rider, but he urged the animal forward. The horse was induced to walk on again, although apparently very uneasy. They had not gone many yards before the horse stopped again, so suddenly that the rider had to clutch the animal's mane to prevent being thrown headlong upon the highway. What was the meaning of such strange behavior? Then there flashed through his mind the circumstances of his dream. Yes, there were all the accompaniments of his picture: the bay horse, the moonlit road, the sudden stoppages. Surely it was a warning. Twice had the creature halted, and he recollected his dream made him the third time fall headforemost on the road. He got off, and, throwing the bridle over his arm, coaxed the horse to move onward. He noticed that the animal was covered with perspiration, as if after a hard gallop, and that he was trembling violently. Repeatedly, too, he glanced searchingly at the hedges. What could be the matter? The strange conduct of the horse became yet stranger. More suddenly than before, the animal came to a dead halt. He was in deep distress. His nostrils were distended. Sweat covered his limbs. His eyes were bent in one direction, with every symptom of terror. Not seeing anything remarkable at first in the direction in which the animal was gazing, Foster tried to urge him onward in vain. Passing round to the other side of the animal's head, Foster was induced to look more closely toward that portion of the somewhat low hedge which the horse so intently regarded. There, in the moonlight, hanging, bending, limp, and apparently lifeless over the hedge, was the body of a tall man. With arms outstretched, the figure seemed touching the ground with its fingers, the legs being on the other side of the hedge. What was his horror to see the body move! Slowly, mechanically, the long arms were outstretched, uplifted. The body swayed up, and there in the bright moonlight was the man's face. How ghastly it looked! The glassy eyes were staring at the young man, whose blood seemed chilling in his veins. Motionless, upright as an elm, with outstretched arms, stood the Gaunt Spectre. Its throat was cut. There stood the group, the horse terrified, the young man speechless, terror-stricken, and the hideous something seemingly regarding them with its stony gaze, while blood appeared to flow from its lacerated throat. How long he remained, Foster could not afterward tell, but after an interval that seemed an age, the horrible vision began, as slowly and mechanically as before, to bend its erect body forward until it resumed its former position, hanging over the hedge. With a mighty effort, the young man induced the horse to move on once more, but on looking back he was startled again to see the erect figure of the nocturnal spectre, uplifted arms, ghastly features, and blood-red throat. Just as slowly as before, the tall body went forward. The arms dropped down, until some intervening bushes sent out the horrible apparition from view. Foster reached home near midnight. Afterward, he learned that a man had been murdered on the very spot where he had seen the tall figure. A Spectral Funeral. I was proceeding leisurely on foot to Broad Green when, on passing the church at Knotty Ash, my attention was suddenly arrested by the strange and uncanny appearance of its graveyards. The time was then shortly after midnight. The whole burying ground seemed alive and glistening with 1,000 small bluish lights, which appeared to creep in and out of the different graves, as if the departed spirits were taking a midnight ramble. I stood petrified, not knowing what to make of it, at the same time experiencing a feeling of horror which suddenly took possession of me. Just at this moment, the moon, which had hitherto been more or less obscured by a moving panorama of passing clouds, came, as it would seem, to my assistance, giving me for a very short time the benefit of her companionship. And now appeared the most startling phenomenon of all, a phenomenon which caused the hair to stand on end with fright, a cold numbness of horror paralyzing me in every limb. For, advancing up the road, directly opposite me, came a funeral train, the coffin, borne along with measured tread, covered with an immense black pall, which fluttered up in the midnight wind. At first, I thought I must surely be dreaming, and therefore pinched myself in the arm to ascertain if this were really the case. But no, I certainly was not, for I distinctly felt the nip, and was therefore satisfied as to my wakefulness. What could it all mean, I asked myself, as the cortege gradually approached me, and I began to distinguish the general outline of the bearers. These appeared to be elderly men, and to have lived in a bygone age. All were dressed in the costume of the latter part of the 18th century. They wore tie wigs, and some had swords, as well as the walking sticks mounted with death's heads. I observed only one really young man among the crowd of followers, walking just behind the coffin. His youth, in comparison with the others, perhaps made me take especial notice of him. He was dressed in what appeared to be black velvet, the whiteness of his ruffles standing out in marked contrast to the somber nature of his general attire. He carried a sword, had diamond buckles in his shoes, and wore his powdered hair in a queue. The face of this young man was deathly pale, as were also the faces of all the others accompanying him. Instead of the procession advancing to the gate at which I stood, it turned suddenly and entered the burial ground by the one situated at a few yards' distance. As the coffin was borne through the gate, all the blue spirit lights seemed to rise from the graves, as if to meet the cortege for the purpose of escorting the body to its last resting place, these awful lights adding considerably to the ghastliness of the scene as they floated over the coffin and heads of the mourners. Slowly the procession glided up the pathway, passing the main entrance of the church and, continuing its way in a straight line, finally disappearing at the back of the edifice. Where this most extraordinary funeral went to, or what became of it, I cannot tell, but this much I distinctly aver: that coffin, mourners, and lights, even the pale flickering moonlight, all disappeared as mysteriously as they came, leaving me standing in the darkness, transfixed with astonishment and fright. Upon gathering together my somewhat scattered senses, I took to my heels and never stopped running until I found myself safe in my own house. In fact, I scarcely remember how I got home. After recovering a little from the shock, I immediately aroused a female relative who had retired for the night and related to her the above particulars. She assured me that I must have been suffering from mental hallucination, but seeing the great perturbation of my mind, and at the same time knowing my natural skepticism with regard to all so-called supernatural phenomena, she came to the conclusion that, after all, I might possibly have seen what has been described above. The next day, I made inquiries in the neighborhood of Knotty Ash and ascertained from a very old woman that she remembered a story in her youth having reference to the mysterious and sudden death of an old occupant of Thingwall Hall, who was hastily and quickly buried, she thought, at midnight in old Knotty Ash churchyard. If so, was this a ghastly repetition of the event got up for my benefit, or was it a portent intended to foreshadow the coming of the dead visitor to myself? Now, as I have before stated, I am no believer in ghosts, but certainly this very remarkable experience of mine has entirely upset all my previously conceived notions on the subject, leaving me in a quandary of doubt. On the evening upon which I saw the mysterious midnight funeral at Knotty Ash, I was exceedingly wide awake, had met several cyclists on the Prescott Road, with whom I conversed, and had likewise refreshed myself at the public drinking fountain placed at the top of Thomas Lane. Strange that a few hundred yards further down the road I should encounter so ghastly an experience I shall never forget to my dying day. From the Review of Reviews, London.